or read out like that, it just makes me realise how old I am. So first of all, thank you very much for your very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me here tonight. I'm really quite overwhelmed to see so many people. I thought the 40th anniversary lecture in London got John Curtis, and you're getting me, so thank you all for coming out. And I hope being here tonight means that you don't neglect to vote. Please vote. And I was also rather afraid today that there might be some, Brexit breakthrough, and everybody would be at home watching the Parliament TV or on Twitter, but it looks as though nothing's going to happen until tomorrow. So I think we can just relax for this evening. I'll speak for about 20 to 30 minutes. I did decide not to use slides because I thought, well, you see slides all the time. You probably sit staring at screens all day in work. So let's do something where you have nothing to look at and see how that goes and see what happens. So just sit back and relax. So I had a long introduction here about myself, which you have probably said quite a lot of. I suppose some of the bits perhaps that Christina hasn't really talked about in terms of my role as a social researcher is really trying to do work within government to try and represent the role of social research in many different areas. So on things like producing the National Performance Framework, open government, and just a range of different kind of government initiatives, trying to always make sure that there is that research voice heard at the table within those initiatives. And also trying to think about the kind of methodologies that we use across the government. And that's something that I'm also very keen on, is kind of trying to develop our range of methodologies and our approaches. So I think that through my two roles, as I say, my chief social researcher role, which is really a professional role, and then through my, if you like, everyday job as head of community analysis, I think it gives me a view on both sides, if you like. So I can be purist on one day, and I can be very, very pragmatic on another, in terms of whatever the aim is that I'm trying to achieve in these two different roles. So I'll just start out by just setting out the scope of what I want to cover. I am focusing my remarks mainly on research methodologies that are around face-to-face interactions, where the researcher is, I think, most personally exposed, and where the relationship between the person and professional really comes to the fore. Successful research interactions are built on trust. I think trust is built on many things. It can be, obviously, the application of the right professional processes and procedures, but also mainly through personal contact, personal connections. And I think it's that interaction between the researcher and the researched, and I'll explain why I'm using that word, that forms the basis of a lot of analysis and debate, reflection in the literature, and it's that that really interests me in my working life. Now, the reason I'm using the word researched, which is an ugly word, I'll get that, I went through all sorts of words in my head: subject, participant. They're all loaded. They all have a particular meaning. Researched might be ugly, but it hasn't got a particular meaning attached to it, so just bear with me on that's why I use that word. But I thought before I actually start into my speech properly, I'll just tell you a story about my first foray into research, which shows how things can go very horribly wrong. It was when I was 16, and it was a civics class in school. I went to school in Dublin. We had a subject called civics, and I was asked to develop a research project on an absolutely minimal knowledge of research. I think we probably had 1 hour discussing research. And I was really surprised at this because I didn't see myself as a social scientist. I was a mathematician, but I had an interest in feminism, but I was not a social scientist. However, I thought, right, I'm going to do something interesting here. And I set out to look at the interactions between the travelling community and the settled community in Ireland. And if anybody can think of that, that's quite a controversial kind of issue. And why at age 16 I thought I was the woman to sort this, I do not know. Anyway, I produced 3 questionnaires, one for my classmates, one for my teachers to get the adult perspective, and one for young people who lived in halting sites with the community. So the first 2 were successful in the sense that people filled out the questionnaires. I'm sure they were incredibly leading questions, but they filled them out. But when I came to the 3rd one, I thought, well, how do I do this? And I just wandered onto the nearest halting site, my home in Dublin. Wandered onto the site, people were poking their heads out of caravans, and I started asking questions to random people. They put up with me for about 5 minutes and they set the dogs on me. So I ran, and that was the end of that research project. So, what did you learn from that? Well, really, I think I learned from that, first of all, how arrogant could I be that I thought you just wander onto a site and just talk to people. No consideration of the most basic facts about ethics, about consent, about building trust, rapport, anything that could have been an interesting project had it been done properly. And I think, that lesson for me was an early lesson in how not to do research in the field. I can only hope that these days no student will be quite that inept. But, you learn something from all your experiences. And I learned I can outrun dogs. So moving on from my shortcomings, what I'm going to do now is just look at some of the basic research methods that we've traditionally adopted, and then particularly move on to look at the rise of participatory approaches. I'll then have a look at the factors that I think are critical when we're thinking about any sort of research practice. And the three things I've identified really are around power, ethics, and skills. And then finally, I'll just reflect a little on the future of social research, how the profession can evolve, and how it can stake its claim to being at the centre of policy and practice, which I truly believe. Obviously, thinking about research. So defining research is a complicated business, as most of you will probably know if you've tried to explain your job to other people. At times it can sound a bit amusing. At times it can sound like, oh, I could do that, anyone could do that. And then at times it sounds really, really complicated. So it can be a difficult thing to explain. I think at its most basic, social research is about asking questions about the social world, which sounds very benign, but obviously behind that there's a multitude of issues. I guess whatever methodology you use, or whatever methods you use, there's some common principles I think all researchers will adopt. Research shouldn't cause harm. Ideally, it should be beneficial to participants. It should be based on consent, trust, openness, and it should be of a high quality and honest about its limitations. So I think, no matter what tradition you come from in your research practice, I think those are the things that you hang on to. But there is a basic dichotomy between qualitative and quantitative. We were even talking about it earlier on this evening. When you get a group of researchers together, that always happens. We always get into it. So, obviously quantitative, we are looking at objective measurement, making use of maths and statistical techniques. It requires data, but it requires data that can often be gained through face-to-face interviewing. So even quantitative researchers can't necessarily avoid meeting people, dealing with people, and having to build rapport. It still involves human interaction. And even with the most structured survey, unless you build some sort of rapport and are mindful about how you come across, you will not even get accurate answers to the most structured survey, so it's still important. And I think this was demonstrated for me this year. I was one of the samples selected for the Scottish Household Survey. It was actually really exciting. It was like, oh, I've been selected. My team run the household survey. They were horrified when they heard that I'd been selected. But I thought, no, I'm going to do this because it'd be really nice to be on the other side of the fence. Anyway, the interviewer came along, and I have to say he was such a skilled interviewer. The interview overran by about 30 minutes because I was trying my best to give really good answers because he was asking the questions in a really professional way, in a really good way, really built that discussion, that rapport. And I think he got my life story by the time he left. But it just showed how it could be done even on something that's very, there's a question, there's a question, there's a question. There's not many open questions per se. We're asking very specific questions. But then obviously you can look at qualitative research. And so it's generally based on, as I said, absolutely reliant on personal interaction. What's the purpose? To generate understanding rather than objective measurement as such. Qualitative research mostly doesn't seek to generalise. What you're doing is looking for insights into problems. Now I'm going back to things some of you might remember from university, because I wanted to think about the epistemologies that underpin these, because in the field every day, out and about doing work, particularly if you're doing practical applied work, you tend to forget where some of this stuff comes from. I thought it's worth reflecting on it. Both of these approaches are based on probably particular epistemologies, and it tells you something about the position of the researcher and the role of the researcher and their views. So I think, quantitative, I am generalising by the way, quantitative research I think is generally based on a kind of positive view. Based on the idea that there are observable phenomena. If the researcher is skilled enough, they'll get the data, they'll interpret the data, and they'll get some idea of truth. And they'll retain this objectivity. They'll get a right answer that can be generalised. This kind of research really is loved by a lot of policymakers because it gives an answer. So the answer is 42, the answer is 500, the answer is, people do like that. It has its problems as well. Qualitative research is more about interpretation, and it's about an interpretivist viewpoint. I shouldn't use words I can't pronounce. And that view is based on the idea that there are some truths out there, but what we're really looking for is meaning. So that research paradigm, you're looking to generate understanding in particular situations where you're taking account of things like context, culture, history. It's all about meaning. In that case, you may not retain your objectivity, and that can be extremely difficult. And people can become more invested in the lives of the people that they are researching. Now, I'm sure all of that is familiar to you. And I'm sure you've probably had those arguments yourselves about the merits of the different types of research, the different epistemologies that underpin them. And certainly when I was doing my PhD, that was something we argued about a lot. And your epistemological stance was part of who you were as a researcher. And it was something people felt very, very strongly about. When you go out and you work in a more applied field, doesn't say you lose some of that. But I know certainly in the academic world, that was something that we argued about a lot. But I think whatever method you use, research traditionally, the researcher, researched relationship is not one of equals. You know, the expertise, the skill, the knowledge lay with the researcher. So there was an inbuilt power imbalance. And qualitative researchers would always say they've tried to overcome this power imbalance. But think about it, a lot of the traditional modes of qualitative research that we all have interacted with, they're contractual, people are contracted into projects. They're consultative, so we ask people, we maybe ask them more nicely. They're collaborative, where researchers work with local people, but still on projects designed and managed by researchers. And really quite traditionally, these were the methods that qualitative researchers did use. So while personally they might wish to overcome some power imbalances, the whole structure and institution of what they were doing had those built in, if you like. In everyday practice, and particularly somewhere like the government, we don't really think about these things like that. When we're thinking about what we're doing and how we're doing it, it tends to be very pragmatic. It tends to be issues of timing, resource availability, public acceptability, and much as I hate to say it, fashion. There's fashions in research like there is in everything else. And that's what I'm going to move on to next then. So we've got qualitative, we've got quantitative. But I think the current trend in research methodology is that around action research, participatory research, or participatory action research. Obviously there's a number of different ways of talking about this, all of which perhaps are slightly different. But they're about applied research. Action research is probably more about problem solving. It's about action, it's a cycle of action, it's a cycle of reflection. You're looking to create and share knowledge. Participatory, particularly participatory action research, is probably more about the transfer of power. And it's probably more engaged with that idea of working with communities, with co-participants to bring about change. This type of research is less, it's not based on objectivity of the researcher, or necessarily even the subject expertise of the researcher. But to go back to my epistemological stance, I think it does lend itself to the possibility of having a really emancipatory epistemology, which I think is appropriate for our times. In a time where identity matters and everybody has their voice, I think that idea of, something that is emancipatory is very powerful. Now, I think, we might say this turn of practice is described in layperson terms as being about lived experience. If you deal with ministers, you hear a lot about lived experience. And that places knowledge and agency with the research co-participant and not with the expert researcher. But it offers the researcher who wishes to bring about change an opportunity to do so in a very, very direct way, and not to have to wait until someone reads a publication, maybe a few years hence, and it can take a long time for your research to drift into practice and to have an impact on people's lives. I'll very quickly mention here another trend in social research, and that's the role of big data. So, Christina's the expert here, so I've got to be very careful. Big data can be broadly defined, I think, as the analysis of large quantities of data to infer laws and relationships. Very broad definition. And the successful use of big data depends on the expertise of the researcher and the quality of the data sources. Because it's not primarily based on face-to-face interaction, I'm going to leave it aside for the moment, but I will come back to it later when I talk about ethics and skills, because that's where it is relevant for the future of social research and researchers. So let's just come back now and talk about the three issues that I had mentioned earlier on that I thought mattered in terms of that relationship between the researcher and the researched. Those are power, ethics, and skills. So, the privileged position of a researcher has been strongly emphasised in a lot of literature over the years. And it's not really surprising quite often, given the educational background and quite often the social class of researchers compared to those with which they were researching. I was amused when I was going back in early days, looking at some of the very early researchers, and there's a quote from Beatrice Webb. I mean, it's quite a famous quote, but I liked it. I belong to the class of persons who habitually gave orders, but seldom have ever executed the orders of other people. I thought, goodness me, that's a real holding of personal power. You know? And this woman's a researcher. Now, that kind of, if you went out into the field with that kind of idea, with that kind of personal power attached, and I think I have come across a few people like that, you're certainly going to have a very asymmetric research relationship. But asymmetry comes in many different forms, and sometimes it can be useful. There's two elements of asymmetry that I want to just think about. It's the insider-outsider perspective, and the concept of studying up and studying down. So if you think of insider-outsider, it allows you to use, as an insider, you can use your existing knowledge as a source of power within an organisation or institution. But you can also use your familiarity as a way of putting the research participants at their ease by being one of the gang, one of them. You're not an outsider coming in. So the outsider might seem at a disadvantage, and perhaps at times is subject to the whims of gatekeepers. But the outsider does have the advantage of being able to keep some degree of objectivity and not have to worry about cycling between those two roles, being a researcher, being one of the gang, being internal, which can be really disorientating for everybody involved. So there's pros and cons on both sides. We think of studying up and studying down. So I think studying up, i.e. working with those, studying with those who perhaps more power, knowledge and influence than you in a particular area, can help you to better understand processes and power. And combine that with insights from studying down, i.e. the people who tend to be subjected to those powerful people's machinations. It's really valuable in action research when you want to bring around change, understanding both sides. But in those situations, a researcher, I think, is likely to find themselves in positions where they lack power, they lack knowledge, they lack control, while dealing with other professionals who are professionals in a field that they themselves are not professional in. That situation can be uncomfortable, and I think it requires the researcher to really think about their ideas about methods, ethics, and attitudes. Now, this is something that really interests me, because my own PhD research was based around studying up with senior officials and politicians. So everybody else went out to do PhD projects with people who were, let's say, deprived in some way or another, or disadvantaged in some way or another, and I wanted to study up. But to have a degree of credibility in doing this work, I thought, I read very, very widely. So when I went to see somebody, I was very, very well prepared for each interview. I knew what they were doing very, very well. So I didn't have to waste any time asking for basic factual information. I could get straight into the interpretation. And actually, is this unethical? It was interesting. I was actually so well prepared, I think, for one interview that the interviewee, at a later stage, sent me some material they were working on and asked me if I'd comment on it because they liked my expertise. Which I thought, oh dear, is this good or bad? I'd obviously fooled them, but shouldn't do that. So I think proper participatory research, though, brings challenges to these analysis of power relationships. So true participatory research is collegiate. Researchers and local people work together as colleagues. It's about combining skills in a process of mutual learning. So how does the researcher work in this context? Well, you've got to think about working in partnership from the beginning in designing research. You've got to think about the strengths and inputs that both sides bring, without being patronising, without privileging certain types of education or certain types of experiences. There's something as well about how engaging actually disinterested or sceptical community. Not everybody's out there waiting for us to come out and do research with them. And quite often it's quite a task to actually engage with people in a way that they can actually see some benefit for themselves. And the complexity in many of these types of projects is such that I think one actually needs to negotiate terms of engagement at the beginning so you can guard against misunderstanding and disappointments. So power in that way is leeching away, in a sense, from the researcher. But establishing trust and setting boundaries are important. So researchers here are trying to blur power differentials so that all parties are engaged in all aspects of the research. And this requires, I think, a degree of humility on the part of the researcher, who's probably more accustomed to being the expert, but has to leave that expertise aside. I think a pitfall in working in this kind of way, though, is the temptation to overpromise what can be achieved. It's always better to underpromise when doing this type of work, because it's difficult. But for the academic researcher, there's another dilemma about writing up and publishing. Who's involved in this? What does that mean for the different people involved? What does that mean for producing articles for peer-reviewed journal when your co-participants are pretty unlikely to even be able to access these, even if they did want to? And it brings about a whole range of other issues around communication channels you need, the variety of voices you need to adopt, languages you might need to use to make sure that no part of the community is excluded. So there's a whole lot of things that researchers need to think about in terms of power, and mostly it's about giving it away and thinking how you deal with that. I'm going to move on now to talk about ethics. So, I mean, our research work is governed by a range of guidelines, and you'll all have different disciplines, different professions, different sectors you work in, and there may be different codes and so on that you follow. I'm just starting off tonight focusing on the SRA ethical guidance, which have in common here, and the obligations that are contained in there. So, the SRA guidance are quite broad because you're trying to cover obviously a wide range of possibilities. But, you know, basically it's about avoiding intrusion, obtaining informed consent, protecting the interests of your subjects, enabling participation, and maintaining confidentiality. Well now, they're all relevant, they're all important, aimed at primarily at avoiding harm though, and protecting the research participants. Nothing wrong with that, but I would argue that's quite limited. I think if you move into a participatory research paradigm where the researcher and the research are equal partners, is it about avoiding harm and protecting? Or is there a different set of ethics that need to be developed in and around this kind of research? So, participatory research, I think, is claimed to be more ethical because it takes account of rights, responsibilities, roles in a partnership approach with a respectful approach. But what maybe it doesn't do is take adequately into account the emotions of those involved, whose lives can be turned upside down by becoming engaged in a participatory research project. After all, people involved, that's not their profession, that's not what they do. We're expecting a lot from people. However, from the academic researcher, it can also be very isolating, being out by yourself in the community, dealing with people in the community, a very isolating situation. And can put you really at odds with your institution as well in terms of perhaps their expectations and what's available to you in terms of time and the kind of outputs that are expected by your academic or your professional institution. At worst case, particularly in that rather more isolated researcher, runs the risk of just being manipulated by a community that actually wants to show a particular position. We can't always assume that everybody is benign in their intent. But from the perspective of co-researchers in the community, if we work with people in the community, that can bring about conflict within communities with community members. It brings real challenges for maintaining academic standards, anonymity, confidentiality, recording. This can all be a real struggle for people who are working with us as co-participants. And many of them will be doing this work in their spare time. So we're expecting a lot. So although we've positioned this as the way to work, and as I say, we've positioned it as a very ethical way to work, I think we need to think this through a little in some of the things that we're asking of people. And I think it's very important that as professional researchers, we owe a duty to our community partners to be clear about the impact of participatory research projects and not to proceed just because we have an intellectual curiosity. Because it's always terribly, terribly tempting to go out when you just want to get an answer to your question because it's really interesting. But I think we need to be very, very careful, to be honest, with other people about what we're doing here. So I think, looking back on the SRA guidelines, which I quoted a few minutes ago, and applying them to this participatory research, well-being of participants, and the nature that participants should be empowered and that they might be heard, maybe that's more important than privacy and confidentiality in a participatory paradigm. You need to think about that. And depending on the nature of the community engagement, things like individual and community consent, again, might get blurred, might get trickier. Something that, again, that we need to just think about how we achieve. And indeed to ensure that we're not being intrusive in that sense. So I think there's some issues there that we need to have a think about. I'll give you an example of an ethical dilemma that I've experienced quite recently, and that was around our work creating the Social Security Charter as part of the development of the Social Security Agency of the government. So in this case, we had a small number of people who had lived experience of social security. They were drawn from our big social security panels, which are our group of 2,500 people who are working with us. And this group worked very, very intensively with a group of social researchers to produce a charter based on a set of principles that have been enshrined in legislation. We're trying to translate that into something that was meaningful. The group worked very intensively, and ultimately, a number of the group members wanted to speak in public about their experience of this work, how they found it, what they thought of it. And indeed, when the charter was launched, they wanted to be at the launch and to be publicly identified with the charter. Now, this group had originally come from our experience panels, where of course everybody had been promised anonymity, confidentiality. And we had to think a bit about, what do we do in this situation? Because, do we just say no, because originally we had said it's all about confidentiality and anonymity, but then we thought, well no, actually, we need to discuss it with these people and see what is it, why are they making that decision, what is it they really want to do? And I felt the role of the researcher in that case was to just review the ethical position, get kind of consent from the group members who wish to be identified, and offer them really good, I think, guidance and training on dealing with the media. So we didn't just leave them to their own devices, because that really can be quite exploitative of the media. So in that case, I came away from that thinking, that's interesting. If we're going to do more and more of this kind of work, where we really are trying to be co-participants, we need to think about how we handle those issues and how we advise people and work with them about the ethics and, if you like, appearing out in public and talking about what we're doing. There's another ethical issue which I just referred to, which is in relation to big data. So the British Sociological Association has recognised that we need to rethink concepts of informed consent, confidentiality, definitions of public and private, and a whole load of other factors in dealing with big data. I mean, there's also issues around veracity, credibility, digital manipulation. There's many, many issues to think about when dealing with data. I mean, I would argue that in an average project, if you like, individual interviewees at times may not be entirely truthful, but they probably won't skew your whole project. Actually, creating fake facts on social media and watching how quickly they spread, I think is a real example of how with data you really can create a whole sense of fake facts out there and create a whole world of something that isn't actually true. And I think it's a reminder to me to be really honest and open when doing this kind of work, and to be really careful about the sources of data that you're using. So, moving on to the third issue, I wanted to talk a little about skills, capacity. So, I think social researchers are individuals who generally have a curiosity about people and the world they live in. And I like to think that we're also people who are concerned with improving people's lives. I think I first kind of thought about that, my experience of that, when a number of years ago I was at a stall at Edinburgh University Open Day. And so students were coming along, or potential students were coming along with their parents, speaking to people in all sorts of different disciplines, whether they want to come and study. And I noticed everyone was going for the politics stand, and our social policy stand, which was next door, we were just sitting there and nobody was coming to us. So we thought, right, we're going to have to attract some people to come and speak to us. So we kind of got up and started asking people a very blunt question: what are you interested in? Power or people? I thought, if you're interested in power, off you go to the politics. If you're interested in people, come to us. And I still maintain that kind of curiosity about people and an interest in people is the basic requirement to be a good social researcher. But we expect our researchers to be skilled at eliciting information, analysing information, coming to conclusions, and maybe even if we're government, giving advice on what to do next. Our traditional methods and paradigms that underpin our training is around research design. We look at qualitative and quantitative data collection, analysis. We look at a range of IT and personal skills issues. These are the kind of traditional things that probably most of us have experienced when we were training. But the question I'd raise is that enough to enable social researchers to operate in the field in an environment where many people will be working in partnership, using participatory approaches, using skills of collaboration? What about skills of collaboration, influencing, communication? These are vital skills. Are we doing enough to develop those? While we're maintaining, and we need to maintain, academic rigour, do we need to focus more on ensuring that our researchers have a greater range of practical experiences, experience working in community or team settings, greater expertise in communicating their research? Yeah, we're asking a lot, aren't we, of people that we're training? We really are. researchers who want to instead develop a career, say, based around data, particularly big data. How can they be equipped with that sense of what they need? And how do they operate in a field that's changing rapidly all the time? Again, going back to the BSA, which is Sociological Association, they suggest that in a digital environment, our duty of care to our research participants and to ourselves should be reflexively applied using situational ethics that allow for discretion, flexibility and innovation. Now, I think that's a tall order for a novice researcher. I don't really think that helps all that much, and I think there's some way through that we need to think about and the skills and the reflection that is needed for, as I say, a novice researcher dealing with big data. So we can accept that the demands of researchers are multifaceted and can seem conflictual. Going back to some of the points I was making earlier about publication, how do you bring together the idea of publishing world-class research in major journals, with communicating your work to the community, with communicating your work to policymakers, with just involving a range of people in that work? I think there's a really big challenge for researchers who wish to do all of that. Time and resources are key issues, but there's many issues around skills and capacity to do that as well. And for those of you who don't work in academia, and I know there's a lot who don't, how on earth do you balance that kind of client demand, and I know as government we can be demanding clients, with the public, who are really shying away from traditional research methods and are really requiring you to kind of develop more innovation, more creativity, while trying to keep just strict sets of demands, budgets and timing set by commissioners of research. So there's, I think, quite a deal of issues for people, no matter what background, what sector you happen to be working in. One thing I think that's common to us all, though, we work in an environment of uncertainty, and one where expertise, facts, sadly have been devalued, and really make our job more challenging. So I think we need to be confident and articulate in communicating our contribution to the development of policy and practice and to social progress. We need to have confidence in ourselves, because we are living in a very challenging world where people are challenging the notion of expertise, challenging the notion of facts, challenging the notion of interpretation. We need to be very confident in what we're doing. So, okay, let's end on a high. High for me anyway. In the Scottish Government, we nearly doubled the number of social researchers we employed over the last 3 to 4 years. My academic colleagues are most unhappy because we keep poaching staff. But demand continues to grow. We're still recruiting. Policymakers and ministers are really recognising the importance of social research for every stage of policy making. And what's a real joy to me is the number of very high calibre candidates that apply to us every year. So that makes me, as a chief social researcher, feel very optimistic about the future of the profession. And we know that we're in a society which emphasises lived experience and participation. And that skill and the skill of data analysis, social researchers have the skills and the knowledge to make significant contributions. Our understanding of society, our recognising of the importance of social alongside the economic, gives us that kind of, I suppose, cross-boundary as well, understanding needed to work with concepts like inclusive growth and well-being, which are driving much policy development these days. So we have the insight that's needed to work across these kind of boundaries and to help people to think in a way that's a lot more holistic. So what else would I want to say? Well, I think we need to think about what we're asking of our new and the next generation of researchers. We have a job here to do to make sure that they're well supported, that they're well trained, and that they're resilient. There can be quite a hostile environment for researchers, experienced and others, where research can be contestable. We need to stand firm together as a community and seek support from each other. We also need to not forget to celebrate the impact of our own work and the work of our colleagues. So finally, I would just say I think the SRA can play a leading role in ensuring that social researchers have a community of support, advancement and learning that guarantees that we can keep our voice at the centre of social change. So I'll end by just encouraging you all to let's come together and make sure the SRA and ourselves keep a strong voice at the forefront of social research in Scotland. And I'll finish there. Thank you.